Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the National Constitution Center on Independence Mall in Philadelphia. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the United States Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Housed across from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, the center is an interactive museum, national town hall, and headquarters for civic education. In this episode of the Drexel interview, we'll be touring the National Constitution Center and sampling some of the highlights from its exhibits. We are here now with Brian Krish, museum programs demonstrator, who will take us through the center and show us some of its highlights. Brian, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're here in the lobby of the Constitution Center, and I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about the National Constitution Center, its genesis, its reason for being.
As you'd mentioned, we were chartered by an act of Congress. It was sponsored by Senator Arlen Specter in 1988, signed into law by President Ronald Reagan to found a national center for education about the United States Constitution. We ultimately opened here on Arch Street in Philadelphia on July 4th, 2003.
Well, it's a magnificent building, and there's a lot to see. I know visitors come from all over the country, all over the world, to visit this center, and we're going to sample some of its highlights. So let's begin.
Sounds good to me.
We're here now in what could be called the heart of the National Constitution Center. It's the largest and most permanent part of the museum, the We the People galleries, that contains numerous exhibits, interactive exhibits regarding the founding and the history of our country. Brian, could you tell us a little bit about this place that we are now standing?
Of course, yes. As you mentioned, we call this the story of We the People, and we are the Museum of We the People. Most visitors coming to the National Constitution Center, this is going to be their first experience here. After catching our Freedom Rising presentation, they'll come in here, we'll see this wall with that preamble of the Constitution, introducing the Constitution and its goals, and we may have a staff member welcome them and tell them all about many of the exhibits that we'll see here today.
So now we're going to see some of your favorites and some of the most popular, and you'll take us through.
Sounds good to me.
Well, we're here now in front of one of the newly refurbished exhibits at the We the People site, and this is the Founders Library. Yes. And I'm particularly interested in this, Brian. Tell us about what we see in this exhibit.
Well, what we have here is an insight into what influenced the framers of the Constitution. If you were drawing up an entirely new form of government, where do you get this inspiration? What do you draw from? It's difficult to imagine creating it from scratch, and so we can see here, and visitors can learn for themselves about many of the documents, from classical texts and philosophy to, for them, contemporary political arguments made that helped influence the direction that the Constitutional Convention took.
So this is the foundation, essentially, of those documents.
Absolutely. These are these sources, these primary sources that Madison and Wilson and all the other framers of the Constitution drew upon when creating the U.S. Constitution.
Well, this rather dramatic display here is called the American National Tree, and I know it's one of the favorites among students who visit, or younger people that visit the museum. Could you tell us what we see here and what's its purpose?
Well, this large metal structure is one of the first things visitors will see in our main exhibition space. It features 100 different men and women and children who've helped contribute to that story of we the people and help influence the direction of the United States and how we interpret the Constitution. And what we do, we add a new face every year, and how we'll decide that students from around the country may enter an essay competition to write for the individual they feel belongs on the national tree. In recent years, we've added well-known figures such as former First Lady Betty Ford, member of the Little Rock Nine, Elizabeth Eckford, and then some lesser-known figures like the first African-American U.S. Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels. And each year on Constitution Day, we'll have a ceremony to induct a new figure on the national tree.
Very interesting. Well, from here, there's a vast expanse of interactive displays that follow, and that I believe would take an entire day to actually go through. I've been here with my children many times, and I know that we've only scratched the surface of what you have available. I wonder if you'd tell me some of what are the most popular and maybe the most significant displays that, as in your mind, that we can show our viewers.
And you're right that it could take all day or more than a day. If you came here as soon as the museum opened, you would still not have quite enough time to watch every video, take part in every interactive, and read every bit of text. I've heard it's something like more than 14 hours worth of information here just in this Story of We the People exhibit. Now, some of the things that visitors very much like, the most iconic parts of the exhibit, we have our voting booths. We've always had voting booths at the Constitution Center. They've changed a bit over the years as we want visitors to consider more why we vote for a candidate, who we're looking to vote for, and really making an educated decision. So when visitors step into our voting booths now, they get a fantasy matchup of the 12 most recent U.S. presidents. They'll get two paired off against one another, and they'll actually get anonymous quotes on different topics, selecting whom they agree with on each issue. Ultimately, you'll find out where you stand in relation to your candidates, and then you may cast your own ballot for yourself after you've considered where each of them stand on the issues.
Who has been the most popular? Have you been able to tally overall in terms of perhaps the last year as to who wins?
Our visitors can actually take a look as they make their way through. We have standings of individual matchups and overall. And of those 12 most recent U.S. presidents, that is from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy has a somewhat substantial lead in first place.
Discuss another exhibit that you think is particularly significant.
Along that outer wall of the exhibition space, we have a number of cutouts where you can actually step into that timeline in a sense and hear a debate, a conversation, a news report, as if you were living in that era. Now, at some points early on, you might hear a debate between Philadelphians in 1787 about whether or not they support this new proposed constitution. You might hear Bostonians protesting against the fugitive slave law, or perhaps you could listen to a fireside chat within a 1940s living room. And so there's different points for visitors to experience the lives of we the people throughout American history.
Are there exhibits that you think have particularly surprised people or enthralled them, which they might not have expected here? Especially, I'm thinking of students that come. I'm sure there are many student visitors that come through here.
Now, I'd say one way to surprise visitors, during that inner path of the exhibit space, we'll have opportunities for guests to play the role of each branch of the federal government. At one point, they may don a judicial robe and weigh in on one of several real-life Supreme Court cases. And visitors can listen to the arguments as they were presented to the court and make their own decision, and then find out whether or not they cast their vote with the majority or with the dissenting opinion. And then, of course, they'll hear the why of it. So they may not agree with the court's decision, but they'll get the understanding of why the Supreme Court perhaps found one way or the other in this particular landmark case.
What are some of the more recent historical exhibits or interactive displays in this section?
Now, one of the more recent ones, if we're thinking of additions to the exhibit, we've added something featuring the Constitute project within our main exhibit space here, where visitors can not just compare, say, as in another part of the museum, the Bill of Rights to constitutions around the world, but compare constitutions from different nations around the world, seeing how they're structured, what sort of provisions they may have, and the powers of their governments in relation to the powers retained by the people. And so it's a great way to see where has the United States Constitution had a great influence on other nations around the world, and where do we diverge greatly from other nations around the world.
And what about the more recent historical, from a historical point of view, the displays that deal with American history?
With American history, we have a number of artifacts, interactives, and more. Different points visitors can see how the right to vote has expanded over the years. We'll have interactives asking could you vote in that particular year, and it'll go all the way up to the present day, so we can see how that definition of we the people and the access to that most basic right to vote has expanded to include, well, virtually all American adults at this point. We'll also have a number of artifacts and videos and panels dedicated to modern historic events, including events that are, of course, still taking part now.
So how is this set of displays? I mean, really, it's a panoply of displays. How are they being updated and revised? Is that an ongoing process? After all, American history is not static.
It is true. The Constitution has the ability to change, and so too, of course, does American history. It is always changing. And we've had several updates in recent years and in recent months. As we mentioned, the Founders Library has updated. We've upgraded the part of our exhibition space dedicated to the American Civil War, as we've been hitting many 150th anniversaries of dates surrounding that. And we'll tell the story of we the people during the Civil War, folks of different backgrounds and their experiences. There's even a point in the exhibit where we can feature real artifacts that visitors may handle and look at themselves to get a better idea of what Americans from 150 years ago went through and how they perceived the events of their day. Beyond that, we have some new graphics and featuring some very important changes to the Constitution and American history. We've updated a feature on the 13th Amendment. We actually have an original copy of the 13th Amendment on display at the moment, and we'll also tell the relevance of the other Civil War amendments, as they are known, the 14th and 15th, that would help define birthright citizenship and grant all men the right to vote.
And I know you have a pretty extensive civil rights aspect to this part of the museum, don't you, where you do display some of the leaders and the important figures in the civil rights movement and in the women's rights movement as well.
Absolutely. Now, we have a number of artifacts and panels within it, many interactives where we can see throughout as these issues have taken hold, and we have a timeline running throughout that outer wall which points out when these events may have taken place, the impact they may have had. And in our daily programming that we offer visitors, we may touch on specific historic anniversaries, important holidays, various civic history months, and a whole lot more.
We're here in one of the most popular sites of the National Constitution Center. It's the Signers Hall, and I have with me the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen, to tell us a little bit about this array of figures. Jeffrey, tell me, are these all the founding fathers? Is this how they're all referred to?
These are the men, and they were all men,
Yeah.
who were at the Constitutional Convention. There were 55 who attended, and in the end, 39 signed. There were also 3 dissenters. They're all here. This room is the exact proportion of Independence Hall, where the Constitution was signed. And the most exciting thing about these statues is that they're all exactly life-size. So you can see in front of me, I see James Madison, who was about 5'4", And I'm looking now at George Washington, who was up to 6'2", or some people think even 6'4", towering over everyone else. And it's so exciting to see kids come into this room, and they just like to get up and touch the framers. You see Ben Franklin's hands are all shiny because people love to rub them. This is totally good luck. And the Pennsylvania delegation, they're just great stories about each of these people, and by showing these framers in their exactly as they looked, it brings out the human side.
The looks, the physique and so forth, how was this determined? I guess there are portraits of many, if not all, of these figures, but the proportions and so forth, how were they determined?
So there is a lot of information about how the framers looked. Yeah. We have portraits, we have articles of clothing. Behind us is Gouverneur Morris's peg leg, which he supposedly got in a carriage accident after, some say it was an assignation, others say it was a carriage accident. but basically there's a lot of evidence about how the framers looked, and these great artists, right before the Constitution Center was opened, spent about 1.5 years creating life-size models.
Well, it's interesting, Franklin himself was a bit of a dandy, wasn't he? So we have some of his measurements for his garments.
I think so, yes indeed. And he certainly cared a lot about his clothes, and look, he looks quite spiffy here, and look at this elegant gold cane.
Yes,
it's
his
really
cane
impressive.
And his knee socks impress me
Very
a great
nice.
deal.
Yes, indeed.
The group over there in the back are the panel of dissenters. Could you tell us, I mean, they've been included, what is their significance and how did they contribute, as you see it, to the founding of this country?
So the dissenters are central to the story of the founding, because these brave anti-federalists initially supported the idea of the Constitutional Convention, which was summoned, after all, to create a government that was strong enough to achieve common purposes, but constrained enough to protect individual rights. But after, in the course of the deliberations, the dissenters, led by George Mason, who I can just see over my shoulder, of Virginia, Mason changed his mind and decided that the Constitution was dangerous because it didn't contain a Bill of Rights. And Mason argued that he had written the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which Jefferson had by his side when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And Mason insisted that without a Bill of Rights, the central government could threaten liberty. So because of their heroic objections, because they refused to sign, those are the refuseniks over there, Mason, Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, famous for, I now pronounce it gerrymandering, but we know it as gerrymandering. Gerry was famous for drawing electoral districts that sloped around like the shape of a salamander, and therefore they're called gerrymanders when they're designed to protect incumbents. But those three men insisted on subsequent amendments to the Constitution, and based on their objections, Madison changed his mind. He had originally opposed a Bill of Rights because he thought that it would be unnecessary or dangerous. Unnecessary because the Constitution itself was already a Bill of Rights. It specifically enumerated powers, and no power that was not granted was supposed to be implied. And he thought it would be dangerous because if you wrote certain rights down, people might assume that if the right wasn't enumerated, it wasn't protected. But based on the objection of those three guys, Madison changed his mind. He came to support subsequent amendments, and many of the state ratifying conventions included subsequent amendments. Madison then cut and pasted among those amendments to draft the Bill of Rights, and we'll talk about that in this next room, which tells the story of how the rights that were promised in the Declaration of Independence are implicit in the Constitution and are finally codified in the Bill of Rights. But this beautiful room sets that story up by showing us both the men who supported the Constitution and those who opposed it, and how they eventually were reconciled around the idea of a Bill of Rights.
Which brings us then to the next room, which contains the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. So let's move there.
Great.
We're here now in the George H.W. Bush Gallery, which contains the three most significant documents in our nation's history: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. They're all here together for the first time, assembled in the National Constitution Center. Jeffrey Rosen, tell us a little bit about the significance of this assemblage.
Well, this is thrilling because this is now one of the only places in the country where citizens can see such rare original copies of the three documents. We have here a stone copy of the Declaration of Independence. In 1823, John Quincy Adams was worried that the original declaration was beaten up after the War of 1812. He wanted a good copy, so he commissioned this engraver, Stone, and by some accounts, Stone took a wet cloth with acid and lifted half the ink off of the original Declaration to make this copy. Bad news for the one that's in the archives, good news for our copy. Others people say he just stenciled it, but it's a beautiful manifestation of exactly what the framers saw. Then we have the first public printing of the Constitution. 2 days after the Constitution is ratified in Independence Hall, it's published in the Pennsylvania Packet newspaper. And this is the first copy that we, the people of the United States, actually saw. So some people think it's more constitutionally significant than the engrossed copy you see in Washington. And finally, this is the most exciting thing of all. We have one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights. George Washington sent 13 out to the states and 1 to the federal government. 12 survive. This one was in the New York Public Library for 100 years, and through a historic agreement, it's going to be shared between the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and New York for 100 years, and we're going to trade it back and forth like a constitutional football. And what's so exciting about this document is it doesn't contain 10 amendments, it has 12. And you can see the first 2 amendments that were proposed and not ratified, and you can examine them on this incredible teaching tool that's right behind us, which we've just launched and which people can find here at the Constitution Center and also online. So here's how it works, if I can get the touchscreen going. Here we go. Technology always helps us. So look, what were the amendments that Madison proposed but were not adopted? This was the one that he considered the most important in the bunch. It would have prohibited the states as well as the federal government from violating fundamental rights like the rights of religious conscience, press, and trial by jury. But that amendment I talked about, which was the original First Amendment that you see in the Bill of Rights, says there shall be 1 representative for every 30,000 people. If this had passed, there'd be 20,000 representatives in Congress today, as opposed to
that would have been unwieldy.
A little bit unwieldy. But it's so interesting because you see that we think of the First Amendment protecting free speech as the most important. For the framers, they were more concerned about apportionment and representation, and those first 2 amendments didn't pass. Our First Amendment was their third.
This also shows the influence of of these great documents on the world at large, doesn't it?
It does. I love this part, and international visitors do as well. So, for example, take the prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures in our Fourth Amendment. The countries in yellow are all the countries that adopted versions of our Fourth Amendment. And if you go to Japan, you can see General MacArthur, when he wrote the Japanese Constitution, cut and paste the American Fourth Amendment. The words are almost exactly the same. 53% of the text matches. By contrast, if you go to the Russian Fourth Amendment, it's a creepy prohibition on spouses not testifying against each other. Very thin protection. It looks very little like ours. So you can pick any right in the world, free expression, and see there's all these controversies about free expression in France right now with Charlie Hebdo. You see the French Declaration of Rights, which really quite broadly articulates the same natural rights philosophies of the framers, but allows for the government to restrict speech whenever it is determined by law. Pick a right, any right, just compare it around the world.
Anywhere in the world.
It's so exciting, and it's the textual comparison that really shows similarities and differences between American conceptions of liberty and those around the globe, and allows us to trace the spread of liberty. This was done with our friends at Constitute, which is the leading collector of global constitutions, and supported by Google Ideas. And we've just opened at the Constitution Center a constitutional drafting lab supported by Google Ideas that's going to convene international constitution drafters, both virtually and physically, to look at what has worked and what hasn't in other constitution drafting and hold drafting exercises and make this a national center for constitution drafting.
That's fascinating. I'm sure this is a very popular site for visitors.
Everyone should check it out online on our site at constitutioncenter.org, and we are working with partners, including the College Board, to get this into every classroom in America. It's really exciting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're ending our tour today at the Overlook of the National Constitution Center, which looks out over the Independence Mall. And it's quite a view. It's spectacular. And I wonder, Brian, if you'll tell us a little bit about this site, both how it was chosen and what we see from this overlook.
Well, the land here has been, since the foundation of Independence National Historical Park, been within the park. And we are still within park boundaries. It's an excellent site. We are just 2 blocks due north of where the Constitution itself was signed at Independence Hall. And so it's a significant site where this is the birthplace of liberty. Not only was our nation founded here with the Declaration of Independence, but our government was created here, and it served as the national capital from our first decade of independence under the Constitution.
So that's Independence Hall, the signing site, right across from us.
Absolutely.
That's quite a historic building. Now, where's the Liberty Bell?
The Liberty Bell will be in a more modern building just across the street from Independence Hall. It's on the 6th Street side there. We can perhaps see it just off in the distance across from Old Congress Hall.
Okay, so it's a little out of sight from us. And what's this park area used for?
Depending at different points of year, we may have performances. There'll be bands playing around Independence Day. I know on Flag Day and the birthday of the Army, there'll be a procession from the Constitution Center down to Independence Mall. And at various points throughout the year, there may be just demonstrations and patriotic observances.
Well, it's a wonderful vista. It's been a wonderful tour.
Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for being here. And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.